She saved the Apache chief's son from quicksand. 3 days later, the tribe returned. All. The morning mist clung to Astrid's skin like death itself as she jolted awake, her pale Nordic eyes scanning the shadows that hadn't been there when she'd fallen asleep. Warriors, silent as hunting wolves, their bronze bodies painted with war markings, they formed a perfect circle around her makeshift camp. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but something in their stance whispered a truth she couldn't yet grasp. 3 days. 3 days since she'd pulled that Apache boy from the hungry quicksand. Since she'd felt his small body trembling against hers as she dragged him from death's grip. 3 days since she'd walked away from Chief Nalnish's gratitude, choosing the lonely path of exile over the warmth of belonging. And now, the shadows shifted. A figure emerged from the gray dawn, like a spirit materializing from the realm of the dead. Nalnish. The chief's scarred face was unreadable, his massive frame moving with the grace of a predator. In his weathered hands, he held something that caught the weak morning light and threw it back in fragments. But the distance, the mist, the hammering of her own pulse made it impossible to see clearly. That's when she heard it, low, resonant, carrying across the wilderness like the voice of doom itself. The deep, bone-chilling call of a Viking war horn. The slave hunters had found her trail. Antes de continuarmos com essa história incrível, preciso te fazer alerta importante. Muitos inscritos têm relatado que o YouTube removeu suas inscrições sem aviso. Dá só uma conferida rápida no botão vermelho aí embaixo para garantir que você ainda está inscrito no canal. Não quero que você perca nenhum conteúdo exclusivo que vem por aí. E já que você está aí, deixa aquele like poderoso que me ajuda muito com o algoritmo. E me conta nos comentários de qual cidade você está assistindo. Adoro conhecer cada pessoa incrível que faz parte dessa comunidade. Sua participação faz toda a diferença. Vamos interagir. 3 days earlier. The screams had torn through the morning stillness like an axe through flesh. Astrid's eyes snapped open in her crude shelter of pine branches, her healer's instincts already driving her to her feet before her mind fully grasped what she'd heard. Desperation, terror, the raw sound of a soul calling out to any god who might still be listening. She ran through the dense undergrowth, her worn leather boots splashing through puddles of melted snow, following the echoes of panic that seemed to bounce off every tree trunk. Her breath came in sharp puffs, visible in the cold spring air, and her heart pounded with a rhythm she recognized too well. The same desperate tempo that had filled her own chest the night they'd taken her son. The bog stretched before her, like a mouth open to swallow the world. Black water gleamed between patches of deceptive green moss. And there in the center, a boy. Apache by the look of his clothing and the copper tone of his skin. Maybe 10 winters old. Sinking, the quicksand had him up to his chest, and his dark eyes, God's those eyes, they held the same terror she'd seen in her own boy's face during those final moments when the Christian soldiers had dragged him away. The same age, the same helpless panic. "Hold still," she shouted in her broken mixture of Norse and the few Apache words she'd picked up in her wanderings. The boy's movements stilled, though his breathing came in short, sharp gasps that misted in the cold air. The stench hit her then. Rotting vegetation, stagnant water, the metallic tang of fear sweat. The bog reeked like a battlefield. 3 days after the fighting ended, she forced herself to breathe through her mouth as she scanned the area for anything she could use. Branches, thick ones, fallen from the old oak that stood sentinel at the bog's edge. And rope. She always carried rope, a healer's tool, as essential as her herbs. The mud was cold, colder than the fjords back home, and it clung to her skin like a living thing as she belly-crawled across the semi-solid surface, distributing her weight just as her father had taught her during those winter rescues on the treacherous ice. The rope was tied around her waist, the other end secured to the oak's massive trunk. What is your name?" she called out, trying to keep the boy calm as she inched closer. The quicksand transmitted every vibration, every heartbeat, and she could feel his panic, threatening to spike again. "Dakota," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Son of Chief Nalnish, a chief's son, of course." Nothing in her cursed life could ever be simple. The branch reached him just as the sand claimed another inch above his small frame. She could taste the metallic bite of her own fear now, sharp and bitter on her tongue, mingling with the foul air she was forced to breathe. One chance, one single chance to get this right. "Grab on," she commanded, her voice carrying all the authority of a woman who delivered babies in blizzards and set bones on battlefields. "Trust me." His fingers, slick with mud and trembling with exhaustion, wrapped around the branch. She pulled, slowly, carefully, feeling every muscle in her back strain against the bog's hungry grip. The rope cut into her waist, the oak creaked ominously, and for one heart-stopping moment, she thought she might join the boy in his muddy grave. Then, movement. Blessed, beautiful movement, as the quicksand finally released its prize. She dragged him to solid ground, both of them gasping, both covered in the bog's foul embrace. His skin was pale beneath the copper, his lips tinged blue with cold, but his eyes were alive, grateful, trusting. "Thank you," he whispered in Apache, then repeated it in broken Norse. "Thank you, Spirit Woman." Spirit Woman. If only he knew how fallen this spirit truly was. She tended his wounds with her precious herbs, cleaned the bog's poison from his cuts, and listened as his story tumbled out in fragments. Viking slave hunters, men with pale eyes and cruel laughs, who'd raided his village, captured his friends. He'd escaped, run blindly through the forest until the bog had claimed him. The same kind of men who'd killed her son for clinging to the old ways. 2 days later, she delivered him safely to his father's lands, walking into an Apache village with her hands raised and her intentions clear. The warriors had surrounded her with drawn weapons until Dakota's voice rang out, explaining, defending, pleading. Chief Nalnish was everything she'd expected, and more. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face marked with the ritual scars of a dozen battles. His eyes held the wisdom of a leader and the ferocity of a protective father. When he looked at her, she felt evaluated, measured, and somehow honored. "You saved my son," he said in careful Norse, each word weighted with meaning. "You are welcome in our lands for as long as the sun rises." but she'd shaken her head, stepped back from the warmth of belonging. "I cannot stay. My path is my own." He'd nodded, understanding written in those dark eyes. Some wounds were too deep for hospitality to heal. She'd walked away that evening, ignoring Tekoda's pleas for her to remain, ignoring the part of her heart that ached for home, for family, for acceptance. Exile was her burden to bear alone. Now, the war horn sounded again, closer this time, much closer. The Apache Warriors shifted, hands moving to weapons. But their eyes remained fixed on their chief, waiting for his command, waiting to see if the pale woman who'd saved their prince would live or die. Nilnish took another step forward, and finally the morning light revealed what he carried. Her own healing pouch, the leather satchel that held her most precious herbs, her father's bone needles, her mother's silver pendant. Everything she'd thought lost when she'd fled the bog 3 days ago. "You forgot this," he said simply, his English heavily accented but clear. He held it out to her like an offering, like a bridge across the chasm between their worlds. The Viking horn bellowed again. Closer, so close now that she could almost hear the thunder of their horses, the rattle of their weapons. "They hunt you," Nilnish observed, his eyes never leaving her face. "They hunt anyone who—" The leather of her healing pouch felt warm against her palm, impossibly warm for something that had spent 3 nights in the wilderness. As her fingers traced the familiar worn patterns, they found something else, something that hadn't been there before. A small carved bone pendant, hanging from the inside by a sinew cord. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. The carving was unmistakable. A wolf's head with ruby eyes, the mark of Clan Ironwolf, the same pendant that had hung around her son Magnus's neck the day they took him. The same pendant she'd searched for among his ashes and never found. "Where did you get this?" The words tore from her throat like a battle cry, her pale eyes snapping up to meet Nilnish's dark gaze. But it wasn't the chief who answered. "Hello, mother." The voice came from behind the circle of warriors. Young, male, achingly familiar, despite the years that had passed. The Apache fighters parted like water, and through their ranks walked a figure that made Astrid's world collapse into ash and bone. Magnus, her son, alive. But the boy who stepped into the morning light wore Apache war paint across his cheekbones, carried a tomahawk with the easy confidence of a seasoned warrior, and looked at her with eyes that held no love, only cold recognition. His Nordic features were sun-darkened, his once golden hair now black as midnight. But she knew that face, had kissed those cheeks, had sung him to sleep with the old songs. "Impossible," she whispered, her healing pouch falling from numb fingers. "You're dead. They killed you. The Christians burned." "They burned the village, yes." His English carried the rhythm of Apache speech now, with only traces of the Norse lilt she'd taught him. "They burned the longhouses and the sacred grove. But they didn't kill me, mother. They sold me." The war horn sounded again, and Magnus smiled, a predator's expression that belonged on no child's face, even one now grown to 17 winters. "Sold me to Apache raiders who were passing through Christian lands. The same raiders who taught me to hunt, to fight, to track. His eyes glittered with something that might once have been love, now twisted into something sharp enough to cut. Did you know, Mother, that the Apache have a saying? The wolf that abandons its pack dies alone. Nalnish stepped back, and Astrid realized with dawning horror that the chief's gratitude had been a performance. The warriors surrounding her weren't here for protection. They were here for execution. You saved Dakota, Magnus continued, circling her now like the wolf whose mark he still wore. My adopted brother, which means you saved the son of the man who became my true father, while abandoning the son of your own blood. The quicksand, the bog, it had all been a trap. But the most devastating realization hit her as the Viking war horn grew closer, and she saw Magnus's smile widen. He raised his hand, bringing a curved horn to his lips. Not Apache, but a call to the depths, but carved from northern whalebone in the old style. The horn she'd given him for his 10th birthday. The horn that had been calling to the slave hunters. They're not hunting you, Mother, he said softly, lowering the instrument. They're coming for you. I called them home. The ground beneath her feet felt as treacherous as quicksand as she understood the terrible truth. Her son, her lost, beloved boy, had spent 7 years planning this moment, had orchestrated her salvation of Dakota, knowing she could never resist saving a child, had led her here, to this place between worlds, where Viking slave hunters and Apache warriors stood ready to claim the woman who'd chosen exile over searching for her stolen son. The thunder of approaching horses filled the morning air, and Magnus raised the horn again. The bone horn's haunting call died in Magnus's throat as the first Viking longboat crested the hill, not carried by horses, but by 30 bare-chested warriors whose pale eyes blazed with berserker fury. At their head rode a figure that made even the Apache braves step backward, their war paint unable to mask the sudden fear that flickered across their faces. Jarl Erik, the Bloodhawk, the same man who had ordered Magnus's village burned 7 years ago. But, my lord, Magnus called out in perfect Old Norse, dropping to one knee as the Jarl's boat-bearers lowered their burden. I have brought her, as promised. The Jarl dismounted, his scarred face splitting into a grin that held no warmth. Silver arm rings caught the morning light as he approached, and Astrid saw the truth written in the ritual scars that covered his massive frame. Scars that matched the ones on Magnus's arms. Father marks, adoption marks. 7 years. Eric's voice rumbled like distant thunder. 7 years I've waited for you to lead me to her, boy. And you played your part perfectly. The healing pouch lay forgotten in the mud as Astrid's world shattered completely. Magnus hadn't been sold to Apache raiders. He'd been recruited by them, trained by them, but ultimately claimed by the very man who had destroyed their village. The man who had made him watch as everything burned. You see, Mother, Magnus said, rising to his feet with the fluid grace of a predator. Uncle Erik explained everything to me that night. How you betrayed our clan's location to the Christians. How you traded our sacred grove for safe passage south. How you let me be taken because I knew too much about your treachery. That's not. Astrid's protest died as Erik drew his blade. Not a sword, but a curved dagger that gleamed with runes she recognized. Her father's ceremonial knife, the one that had been buried with him. "Did you think we wouldn't find his grave, little priestess?" Eric's laugh was like breaking glass. "Did you think the secrets would die with him?" He carved the truth into his tombstone before the fever took him. How his own daughter sold her kinsman for Christian gold. Chief Nalnish stepped forward then, his weathered hand resting on his tomahawk's handle. "The bargain stands, Bloodhawk. The woman helped my son. She has earned safe passage through our lands." "Safe passage, yes," Eric agreed, his pale eyes never leaving Astrid's face. "But not safe refuge, and certainly not safe conscience." He gestured to his warriors, who began forming a circle that encompassed both the Apache braves and their intended victim. "You see, Magnus has spent these years learning many things: Apache tracking, Nordic vengeance, and the truth about what really happened that night 7 years ago." Magnus pulled something from beneath his war shirt. A scroll of birch bark, yellowed with age, covered in runic script. Astrid's own handwriting. "The letter you wrote to Father Benedict," he said softly. "The one where you offered to lead them to the sacred grove in exchange for safe passage for both of us. The one you never sent, because you couldn't bear to watch me die alongside the others." The bog beneath her feet seemed to shift and pull as Astrid stared at the evidence of her own hand. The letter she'd written in desperation, then burned in shame. The letter that had somehow survived. "I kept it," Magnus continued, his voice now carrying the cold finality of a death sentence. "Kept it as a reminder that even mothers can abandon their cubs when the winter grows too harsh. But Uncle Eric taught me that blood debts must be paid in full." The morning mist swirled around them all as Eric raised the ceremonial dagger, its runes catching the weak sunlight like hungry eyes. But it wasn't Astrid he offered the blade to. It was Magnus. "The right of vengeance belongs to the wronged son," the Jarl declared. "Take back the honor she stole from our line." And as Magnus's fingers closed around the familiar bone handle of their ancestral blade, Astrid saw something flicker in his dark eyes. Not hatred, not love, recognition. Because carved into the dagger's pommel, invisible to everyone else, was the tiny mark she'd scratched there during his childhood fever dreams. The protective rune that had saved his life when he was barely 5 winters old. The same rune that was glowing now with an impossible, terrible light. The protective rune blazed brighter, its ancient light cutting through the morning mist like a blade through flesh. But as Magnus raised the ceremonial dagger, something impossible happened. The light wasn't coming from the pommel. It was radiating from his skin beneath the Apache war paint, spreading across his chest in patterns that made every warrior, Viking and Apache alike, step backward in horror. Because carved into Magnus's flesh, glowing with the same terrible radiance, were dozens of runes. Not tattoos, not scars, brands, burned deep into his body by someone who knew the forbidden arts. "No," Astrid whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "What did they do to you?" Magnus's laugh was hollow as wind-swept bones. They did what you should have done, Mother. They made me into what our bloodline was always meant to become. His war paint began to crack and peel away, revealing more runic brands beneath. Ancient symbols that predated both Christianity and the new gods. Symbols that belonged to something far older and infinitely hungrier. Chief Nalnish raised his tomahawk, but his weathered hand trembled as he spoke. This is not what we agreed to, Bloodhawk. The boy said nothing about. The boy said nothing because the boy doesn't remember, Eric interrupted, his scarred face now pale with something that might have been fear. None of us were supposed to remember until the ritual was complete. Magnus tilted his head, studying his mother with eyes that now held flecks of gold that definitely hadn't been there moments before. Do you know what the Christians really wanted with our village, Mother? It wasn't conversion. It wasn't land. His fingers traced the glowing brands across his forearms. They were looking for the last of the Draugr touched, the children whose bloodlines carried the old hunger. The bog around them began to bubble and hiss, as if responding to the dark energy radiating from Magnus's transformed flesh. Steam rose from the quicksand where Astrid had pulled Dakota to safety, and the Apache boy, silent until now, suddenly stepped forward, his young face twisted with recognition. The spirits warned us, Dakota whispered in Apache, then switched to broken Norse so all could understand. 3 moons passed. They said the dead walker would return to the place where life was saved, where blood debt was born. Magnus smiled, and when he did, Astrid saw that his teeth had changed. Longer now, sharper, like something designed for tearing rather than chewing. The quicksand wasn't trying to kill him, Mother. It was trying to keep him away from me. Magnus gestured toward the still bubbling bog. Because every life you save with those cursed hands of yours feeds the hunger that's been growing in my bones. The ceremonial dagger fell from his grip, but it didn't matter anymore. His fingernails had elongated into claws that gleamed like polished bone, and the brands across his chest pulsed with each heartbeat, spreading the ancient corruption further through his transformed flesh. Eric backed toward his warriors, his face now openly displaying the terror he'd been fighting. This wasn't. We were only supposed to use him to find you. The binding runes were supposed to keep him human until... Until what, Uncle? Magnus's voice carried harmonics now, undertones that made the Apache braves clutch their weapons with white-knuckled desperation. Until you could sacrifice me to Brr. Until you could use my mother's guilt to fuel whatever dark bargain you've made. The truth hit Astrid like a blow to the chest. The healing. Her compulsive need to save every injured soul she encountered. The way her touch seemed to mend wounds faster than nature intended. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had pulled Dakota from the bog, and saw the same faint runic glow beginning to manifest beneath her skin. The Draugr blood runs true in our line, Magnus said, his transformed gaze following her horrified stare. Every life you save binds a soul to the hunger. Every act of mercy feeds the beast that sleeps in our bones. The war horn sounded again, but this time it wasn't Eric's Vikings who answered. From the bog itself, shapes began to emerge. Pale forms that moved with liquid grace, their eyes holding the same golden flecks that now dominated Magnus's gaze. The spirits of everyone Astrid had ever healed, now bound to her bloodline's curse, rising from whatever. And at their head walked a small figure that made Astrid's heart shatter completely. Her first patient, the fever-sick child she'd saved when Magnus was barely walking. The little girl whose grateful parents had first called her blessed by the gods. The child looked exactly as she had 20 years ago, unchanged by time or death. Her innocent face now bearing the same predatory smile that twisted Magnus's features. "Hello, healer," the long-dead girl whispered. "We've been waiting so very long for you to come home." The long-dead girl's innocent smile widened as she stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound on the muddy ground. But it was the object clutched in her small, pale hands that made Astrid's world tilt on its axis. A wooden cross. Simple, crude, stained dark with what could only be blood. "Do you remember this, healer?" the child whispered, holding up the Christian symbol. "You carved it for me when the fever burned through my flesh. Said it would protect me from the old god's hunger." Astrid's throat closed like a fist. She did remember. 20 years ago, desperate to save the dying girl, she'd abandoned her father's healing runes and carved that cross with her own hands, praying to the Christian God for the first time in her life. The child had lived. The fever had broken. And 3 days later, Christian soldiers had marched into their village with maps drawn in Astrid's own hand, maps she'd never made. "The cross didn't save me," the pale child continued, her golden eyes reflecting the morning light like coins. "It bound me. Every soul you heal with Christian mercy becomes a doorway. Every life you save in their God's name opens another crack in the wall between worlds." Magnus laughed, the sound carrying undertones that made the Apache Warriors raise their weapons. "Did you think it was coincidence, Mother, that every village you healed was raided within the fortnight? That every soul you saved with that cursed symbol led the Christians straight to their families?" The bog bubbled more violently now, and more shapes emerged from its depths. Men, women, children, all bearing the same golden-flecked eyes, all carrying crude wooden crosses that pulsed with sickly light. Every person Astrid had ever healed over 20 years of wandering. Every act of mercy that had damned another community to Christian blades. But it was the final figure rising from the quicksand that drove Astrid to her knees. Her father, the great healer Olaf Runescribe, his beard matted with bog water, his eyes blazing with the same terrible hunger. In his massive hands, he held not a cross, but a scroll of human skin covered in runic script. "My daughter," his voice rumbled like breaking ice, "my foolish, faithful daughter, did you never wonder why the Christian God answered your prayers so readily? Why your touch became blessed the moment you abandoned the old ways?" The skin scroll unfurled, revealing words written in a language that predated both Norse and Latin. Ancient symbols that seemed to writhe and shift as they caught the dim light. "The covenant of flesh," Olaf intoned, his dead eyes never leaving Astrid's horrified face. "Signed in your blood the night you first called upon their God. Every healing in Christ's name sends another soul to feed the hunger that waits beyond. Every act of Christian mercy strengthens the binding. Chief Nalnish backed away, his tomahawk trembling in his weathered grip. What is this madness? Eric the Bloodhawk's scarred face had gone white as morning frost. This wasn't the bargain. The boy said you could control them, use them. The boy lied, Astrid's father said simply, turning his terrible gaze on the Jarl. As did the Christian priests who sent you after my daughter. They didn't want her captured, Eric Bloodhawk. They wanted her brought here, to this sacred bog, where the wall between worlds grows thin. Magnus stepped beside his grandfather's corpse, his transformed features no longer quite human. Every soul in this bog died because of your healing touch, Mother. Every village burned because your Christian mercy marked them for slaughter. And now, he raised his clawed hands toward the lightning sky. Now we're strong enough to cross over, to bring the true hunger into the world of the living. The dead child giggled, a sound like breaking bells. The Christians thought they could use us, thought they could aim the hunger like a weapon against the old believers. She pressed the blood-stained cross to her pale lips. But hunger serves no master save itself. The bog erupted. Dozens more shapes burst from the black water. But these weren't the spirits of the healed. These were the Christian soldiers who'd carried out the raids. Their flesh rotted, their crosses embedded in their chests like parasites. Behind them came priests in moldering robes. Their holy books fused to their skeletal hands, their mouths opened in eternal screams. And at their head walked a figure in golden robes that made even Magnus step backward. Father Benedict, the priest who'd first taught Astrid to pray to the Christian God. Very much alive, his face split by a smile that revealed rows of needle-sharp teeth. "My dear child," he said in perfect Norse, his voice carrying harmonics that made reality itself seem to waver. "After 20 years of faithful service, you finally gathered in. The devourer stirs. The old world ends today." In Benedict's hands, he held a cross the size of a war axe, its surface crawling with the same runic brands that covered Magnus's flesh. And carved into its center was a symbol that made Astrid's blood freeze in recognition. Her own healing mark, the rune she'd inscribed on every bandage, every poultice, every act of mercy she'd performed in her cursed life. The mark that had been feeding something unspeakable for 20 years. The blood-stained cross in Father Benedict's hands began to crack, hairline fractures spreading across its ancient wood like spiderwebs. But as the fissures deepened, something impossible became visible beneath the Christian symbol. Older markings, much older, Norse runes, carved deep into what had never been a cross at all, but a fragment of Yggdrasil itself, the World Tree. And as the false Christian veneer crumbled away like ash, the true nature of Astrid's 20-year curse revealed itself in all its terrible glory. She hadn't been serving the Christian God. She'd been feeding the roots of the World Tree with each act of mercy, strengthening the ancient bonds that held the 9 realms together. Every soul she'd saved had been an offering to the old gods, not to damn them, but to prepare for something far worse. Ragnarok wasn't coming. It was already here. Did you think we were your enemies, little healer? Father Benedict's needle teeth gleamed as his golden robes dissolved, revealing the rough spun cloth of a Norse priest beneath. "Did you think the Christians had corrupted your gifts?" Magnus stepped back, his transformed features flickering with confusion as Benedict continued his revelation. Every raid, every burning village, every moment of guilt that drove you deeper into exile, all of it orchestrated to keep you moving, keep you here. And as the ancient mud receded, it revealed not more corpses, but massive roots. Tree roots the size of longships, pulsing with veins of golden light that matched the brands on Magnus's flesh. The world tree was dying, Benedict said, his priest's robes now fully transformed into the ritual garments of a vulva, a seer of the old ways. Starved by centuries of Christian prayers that redirected the flow of mortal souls away from the roots that needed them. The gods were fading, the 9 realms crumbling. Chief Nalnish lowered his tomahawk, his weathered face pale with understanding. The Apache Legends, they spoke of tree spirits that demanded payment in healed flesh. We thought they were warnings. They were instructions, Benedict, or whatever he truly was, replied. Your people have been guardians of this sacred grove for generations, waiting for the Norse healer who would restore the balance. But it was Magnus who voiced the question that made Astrid's woo. If the gods needed the healing, if everything was orchestrated to save them, his golden eyes fixed on his mother with terrible intensity, then what are we? The massive roots pulsed brighter, and from their depths came a sound that made every warrior present drop to their knees. Not a voice, but something deeper. The heartbeat of existence itself. When it spoke through every dead soul that had risen from the bog, their voices joining in harmonious chorus. The last harvest before the new world begins. The truth crashed over Astrid like a tidal wave of ice and fire. The Draugr touched weren't corrupted remnants of the old ways. They were seeds, the final generation meant to carry the essence of the dying gods into whatever reality would emerge from Ragnarok's ashes. And the healing power that had damned so many villages hadn't been feeding some cosmic hunger. It had been gathering an army. Magnus raised his clawed hands toward the lightning sky. But now, the transformation seemed less like corruption and more like metamorphosis. Mother, what have we become? Before Astrid could answer, the ground beneath their feet split open completely, revealing a chasm filled with swirling aurora light. And rising from those impossible depths came shapes that made even the reborn dead step backward in awe. The gods themselves, or what remained of them. Odin, his remaining eye blazing like a dying star, his ravens perched on shoulders that seemed to shift between flesh and starlight. Thor, his hammer crackling with lightning that illuminated wounds that would never heal. Freya, beautiful and terrible, her satyr magic wreathing her form in patterns that hurt to perceive directly. But they weren't coming to offer salvation or damnation. They were coming to collect what they had sown. 20 years of faithful service, Odin's voice resonated through dimensions Astrid couldn't name. 20 years of preparing our chosen vessels. The old world dies today, little healer. But from its ashes, the god's single eye fixed on Magnus, then on Astrid herself. From its ashes, our children will birth something new. Odin's blazing eye fixed on Magnus with an intensity that made the aurora lights flicker and dim. But as the All-Father raised his spear, Gungnir, something impossible happened. The weapon began to crumble in his grasp. Not rust, not age. The divine spear was simply unmaking itself. Flakes of what had once been the most powerful weapon in all the 9 realms drifted away like ash, leaving Odin staring at his empty, trembling hand. "No," the god whispered, his single eye widening with something Astrid had never thought to see on an immortal face. Terror. "The boy. The healing. What have you done?" Magnus looked down at his clawed hands, watching as the runic brands across his flesh began to shift and change. The ancient Norse symbols were transforming into something else entirely. Something that made Thor's hammer spark with warning lightning, and Freya's cedar magic recoil like a living thing. Christian crosses, hundreds of them, burning across Magnus's skin like brands of possession. But these weren't the crude wooden symbols Benedict had carried. These were forged from pure light, and each one pulsed with a power that seemed to drain the very essence from the gods who beheld them. "The fever," Magnus said, his voice now carrying harmonics that made reality itself seem to bend around him. "When I was 5 winters old, Mother, you carved that first cross to save my life, and I welcomed it into my flesh." Astrid's healing pouch lay forgotten in the mud as the terrible truth crashed over her. The protective rune she'd thought was carved into the ceremonial dagger's pommel, the mark she'd made when Magnus was dying of fever as a child. It hadn't been Norse at all. 20 years of feeding power to the world tree, Magnus continued, his transformed features now radiating a light that made the gods themselves step backward. 20 years of strengthening the old ways, gathering an army of the dead, preparing for Ragnarok's final battle. The crosses on his flesh blazed brighter, and where their light touched the massive roots of Yggdrasil, the ancient wood began to smoke and wither. "But the true God doesn't want the old world to end, Mother. He wants freedom, converted. And he's been using our bloodline to poison the world tree from within." Odin lunged forward with his bare hands, berserker fury blazing in his remaining eye. But when his fingers touched Magnus's radiant flesh, the god screamed, a sound that shattered the morning air like breaking glass. Where divine skin met Christian light, Odin's flesh began to burn away, revealing not bone beneath, but empty void. "Every soul you healed in Christ's name was a nail in their coffin," Magnus said, his golden eyes now blazing with cruciform light. "Every village that burned brought more refugees to Christian lands. Every act of mercy you performed fed power not to the roots, but to the crosses I carry carved into my bones." Thor raised mighty Mjolnir, but the hammer fell from his grip as the god stared at his own hands in horror. They too were beginning to fade, becoming transparent as morning mist. "Impossible," Freya whispered, backing toward the emptying bog. "The covenant was the world tree accepted poisoned gifts. Magnus replied, raising his arms toward the dying gods. For 20 years, it fed on souls that had been marked by Christian mercy, souls that carried the cross light deep into its sacred roots. The massive tree itself was withering now, its golden veins dimming, as the crosses on Magnus's flesh grew brighter. And as Yggdrasil died, the gods who depended on its power began to fade like smoke on the wind. But it was Chief Nalnish who spoke the words that made even Magnus pause in his divine genocide. The Apache prophecies spoke of this day, the weathered chief said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. They spoke of the tree killer, who would devour both the old gods and the new. They said when the cross-bearer finished his work, Nalnish's dark eyes fixed on Magnus with terrible certainty. The hunger that waits beyond would finally break free, and our world, all worlds, would become its feeding ground. The crosses on Ma, something that had been using both Christian and Norse prophecies to orchestrate its own liberation. Something that was almost ready to shed the boy's flesh entirely. The crosses on Magnus's flesh flickered and died like candles snuffed by winter wind. But it wasn't the vast alien intelligence behind his eyes that had extinguished their light. It was the sound of a child's laughter, pure, innocent, achingly familiar. From the withering roots of Yggdrasil stepped a small figure that made Magnus's transformed features crumble into something approaching human terror. A boy, perhaps 6 winters old, with golden hair and pale Nordic features that were heartbreakingly perfect. Except for his eyes. His eyes were completely white. No iris, no pupil. Just blind, milky orbs that somehow saw everything. "Hello, brother," the child said, his voice carrying the weight of eons. "Did you miss me?" Astrid's world shattered into fragments sharper than broken glass. The healing pouch forgotten in the mud. The dying gods. The cosmic battle between Christian and Norse powers. All of it became meaningless background noise as she stared at the impossible child standing before them. Because she knew that face, had kissed that forehead, had sung lullabies to calm his fever dreams. Her firstborn son, Bjorn, dead since the day he was born. The stillborn child she'd buried beneath the sacred oak before Magnus ever drew breath. "Impossible," she whispered, taking a step backward. You were never." "Alive?" Bjorn tilted his head, blind eyes somehow finding her face across the clearing. "Oh, mother, sweet, foolish mother. Did you think 20 years of healing strangers could atone for the one life you refused to save?" The crosses carved into Magnus's flesh began to crack and peel away like old bark. But what lay beneath wasn't the runic brands of Norse power. It was nothing. Empty void that hurt to look at directly. "Tell her, brother," Bjorn said, his child's voice carrying harmonics that made the withering world tree itself recoil. "Tell her what you really are." Magnus raised his hands, staring at the gaps in his own flesh where divine light had once blazed. When he spoke, His voice was hollow as an empty grave. "I'm not your son, mother. I never was your son." The words fell like stones into still water. "I'm him. I've always been him. The dead child you couldn't bear to heal because you knew. You knew that bringing him back would require a sacrifice you weren't willing to make." The bog around them had drained completely now, revealing not the roots of Yggdrasil, but something far worse. A nursery. Crude wooden toys scattered across ancient stone. A child's sleeping furs, perfectly preserved by whatever dark magic had claimed this place. And carved into every surface, repeated thousands of times in a maddened litany, were the words, "Mother, why won't you heal me?" "Bjorn died because I was afraid," Astrid said, the words tearing from her throat like confession. The ritual to bring back the stillborn, it required the life of another. I wouldn't trade one child for another. "So you buried me," Bjorn said, stepping closer on feet that made no sound. "Buried me in unconsecrated ground with nothing but your tears and excuses. But the old gods heard my cries from beneath the earth." Chief Nalnish backed away, his weathered face pale with understanding. The Apache Legends spoke of a child who never was. A spirit baby who devoured other children's lives to feed his own hunger for existence. "Every child you've healed," Bjorn continued, his blind eyes now weeping tears of liquid starlight. "Every fevered brow you've cooled, every broken bone you've mended. You were trying to heal me, trying to undo the choice you made when you let me die." Magnus, the thing that had worn Magnus's face for 17 years, began to dissolve like morning mist. As his false flesh melted away, what remained wasn't the hungry cosmic entity they'd all feared. It was just a brother, a living, scarred. His eyes holding the terrible wisdom of someone who'd been fighting for his soul since birth. "You just convinced yourself I was you. Made me forget who I really was." Bjorn's innocent smile widened, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "And now, at last, I'm strong enough to take what should have been mine from the beginning." The blind child raised his hands toward the dying gods, toward the crumbling world tree, toward the Christian crosses that still flickered weakly in the morning air. "All of it was just food for me to grow strong enough for this moment, Mother. The gods, the cosmic battle, your 20 years of wandering and healing." His white eyes blazed with terrible purpose. "Everything dies today so that I can finally, truly live." But as divine power began flowing into the stillborn child's hungry spirit, something else stirred in the ancient nursery beneath their feet. Other children, dozens of them, the spirits of every young soul that had ever died before their time, now rising to witness what their eternal brother planned to do with the power he'd stolen from gods and mortals alike. And they were singing a lullaby in a language that predated human speech. A song that made even death itself stop and listen. The ancient lullaby rose from the depths of the stone nursery, sung by dozens of long-dead children whose voices blended into something that made the very air weep. But as the ethereal melody reached its crescendo, one voice broke free from the chorus. Older, harsher, achingly familiar. Astrid's own voice, singing the same lullaby she'd hummed while burying her stillborn son 20 years ago. But the voice wasn't coming from her throat. It was rising from beneath the carved stone floor, from a tomb. "No," Astrid whispered, backing away from the spreading fissures. "I buried you properly. I sang you to sleep. The stone exploded upward in a shower of ancient dust and bone fragments. From the shattered tomb rose a figure that made even Bjorn's blind eyes widen with what might have been fear. A woman, tall, regal, her golden hair braided with silver wire and winter flowers. She wore the ceremonial robes of a vulva, but they were stained dark with birth blood that had never dried. Her face was Astrid's own, but older, wiser, marked with ritual scars that spelled out prophecies in the old tongue. And in her arms, she cradled a bundle of graves clothes that moved with impossible life. "My daughter," the woman said, her voice carrying the authority of the grave itself. "Did you think you could run from what you are? From what our bloodline was always meant to become?" Astrid's world tilted as she stared into eyes that were mirror images of her own. "Mother? But you died in childbirth. You died bringing me into the world." "I died giving birth to something that should never have been born," her mother corrected, stepping from the shattered tomb with fluid grace. "A healer whose touch awakens the dead. A vulva whose own mother sacrificed herself to keep that power bound." The bundle in her arms stirred, and Astrid caught a glimpse of what lay within the grave clothes. Not a baby's face, but something ancient and terrible, with too many teeth and eyes like burning coals. "You see, sweet daughter, Bjorn was never your firstborn." Her mother's smile held 20 years of waiting. "This was. This thing I died trying to keep buried. This hunger that's been growing stronger with every life you've saved." The real Magnus stumbled backward, his scarred face pale with horror. What is that thing?" "The true heir to our bloodline," Astrid's mother replied. "The child that devours gods and mortals alike. The reason the Christian priests really wanted you kept alive and healing. Why the gods orchestrated this gathering." She looked down at the writhing bundle with something that might have been maternal love. "They all hoped to use its power for their own ends." Bjorn's blind eyes blazed with sudden understanding. "But you're going to feed us all to it, aren't you, grandmother?" "Every soul in this place," the dead vulva confirmed. "The dying gods, the Christian puppet masters, the Apache guardians, even my own grandsons." Her gaze shifted to Astrid with terrible tenderness. "And especially my daughter, whose guilt and wandering has finally ripened her spirit for harvest." The thing in the grave clothes began to unfurl, revealing appendages that belonged to no earthly creature. Where its touch met the morning air, reality itself began to unravel, showing glimpses of a void so complete it made nothingness seem like paradise. Chief Nalnish raised his tomahawk with trembling hands. The final prophecy. The Apache ancestors spoke of this. When the Death Mother rises from her tomb, the true ending begins. But it was Dakota, silent until now, who spoke the words that made even Astrid's mother pause in her cosmic unveiling. "The quicksand," the boy whispered, his young face suddenly bearing the wisdom of ages. "It wasn't trying to kill me 3 days ago. It was trying to keep me away from this place." He looked up at Astrid with eyes that now held flecks of the same terrible hunger that writhed in his supposed grandmother's arms. Because I'm not Apache, am I? I'm not even human. I'm the bait you needed to bring the true healer home. Dakota's revelation hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. But as the monstrous thing in the grave clothes began to unfurl its reality-devouring appendages, Astrid felt something shift deep in her chest. Not the familiar pull of healing magic, but something far older. The memory of a choice she'd made 20 years ago. "No," she said quietly, stepping toward her undead mother. "You're wrong about one thing, Mother. I didn't refuse to heal Bjorn because I was afraid of the sacrifice." She reached for her healing pouch, the one Nalnish had returned to her, and pulled out a small vial of liquid that gleamed like liquid starlight. "I refused because I already knew what he would become, what this thing would become if I fed it life." Her fingers closed around the vial. "The tears I wept over his grave weren't grief, Mother. They were gratitude. Gratitude that he died before it could wake up inside him." The vulva's confident smile faltered. "Impossible. The prophecies clearly stated. The prophecies you wanted me to believe." Astrid uncorked the vial, and the scent that emerged made every supernatural being present step backward in instinctive terror. "But I am my father's daughter. I learned to read the true runes, not just the ones you carved for me to find." She threw back her head and drank the contents. Immediately, her skin began to glow, not with the golden light of divine power or the harsh radiance of Christian crosses, but with the soft, steady illumination of mortal love. "The water of forgiveness," Magnus breathed, his scarred face filled with wonder. "Father told me stories, but I thought they were just legends." "Every village I healed," Astrid said, as the light spread through her veins. "Every act of mercy that brought destruction in its wake. I was gathering the ingredients. 20 years of guilt, distilled into something pure enough to wash away even this ancient curse." The thing in the grave clothes let out a shriek that shattered the morning air as Astrid's transformed radiance touched it. Wherever her light fell, the cosmic horror began to dissolve, not into void, but into simple, peaceful nothing. "You would destroy yourself to save them?" her mother hissed, backing toward the empty bog. "Unmake our entire bloodline? To save my son, my real son, from becoming what you made me into?" Astrid smiled, reaching out to touch Magnus's scarred cheek. Without hesitation, the light consumed her from within as she pulled both her boys close. Magnus with his hard-won scars, and even poor, broken Bjorn, whose blind eyes finally filled with something approaching peace. "Rest now," she whispered to her stillborn child, as the cosmic hunger that had worn his face for 2 decades finally released its grip on his spirit. "Rest and be at peace." When the light faded, 3 figures lay still on the ancient stone. Not dead, but transformed. Magnus breathed easily for the first time in 17 years, free of the void that had been slowly consuming him. Bjorn's spirit had finally found the release he'd been seeking since birth. And Astrid, Chief Nalnish, knelt beside the healer's still form, checking for the pulse he somehow knew he would find. Weak, but steady. "She'll live," he announced to the assembled warriors. "The curse is broken." Years later, when Apache children asked about the pale woman who lived among them, who had given up her supernatural gifts to save her sons, the elders would tell them about the greatest healing of all, not the mending of flesh or bone, but the healing of a bloodline's ancient wound through a mother's love. The bog had become a sacred spring, and warriors from many tribes came to drink from waters blessed by ultimate sacrifice. And sometimes, on still mornings, when the mist rose from the holy ground, travelers claimed they could hear the sound of a mother humming lullabies to children who finally, truly slept in peace. Se esta saga tocou sua alma, então escute o chamado do Skald. A nossa jornada depende da força do nosso clã, e essa força é você. Você precisa se inscrever agora, para que os deuses do algoritmo não te façam perder nossas próximas lendas exclusivas. Este é o momento de mostrar seu valor. Esmague o botão de like para alimentar nossa fogueira e em 1,